https://www.fanmemspace.com/tin-tuck/fake IP-try-and-duet. The cold came early to Ridgefield that year. By the second week of October, the leaves along Route 9 had already turned deep amber and rust, in a brown so dark it looked almost black in the early morning light. The sycamores that lined the road dropped their bark in pale strips, leaving the trunks ghostly white against the gray Virginia sky. The Coldwater River ran high and fast beneath the old Route 9 bridge, fed by 3 weeks of rain that had soaked the hills and turned the creek beds into rivers and the rivers into something wilder. Beckett Calloway knew the sound of that river better than he knew almost anything else. He knew the way it muttered low and steady on calm nights, a sound almost like breathing. He knew the way it roared after rain, the way the current changed pitch depending on how swollen it had become. He knew the smell of it, that cold mineral living smell that seeped into everything under the bridge, into his sleeping bag, into his clothes, into his hair, even after he washed it in the school bathroom sink every morning before first period. He had been sleeping under the Route 9 bridge for 8 months. He did not think of it as home. He thought of it as the current situation. He was careful about language like that, about the stories he told himself, because he had learned early that the stories you told yourself were the ones you ended up living inside. He was not a homeless kid. He was a kid in a temporary situation who happened to sleep under a bridge. The distinction mattered. The tarp was blue military surplus bought with money he had earned washing windows at the Sunoco station on Millbrook Road. He had stretched it between 2 concrete support pillars using a rope he had found behind the hardware store. A good thick rope, the kind that did not give even when the wind came hard off the river. Beneath the tarp, a sleeping bag with a busted zipper he had fixed with a safety pin, a wool blanket someone from the First Methodist food pantry had pressed into his hands last March, and a cardboard box that served as both dresser and desk. The box held everything he owned: a change of clothes, jeans, a flannel shirt, 2 pairs of socks folded with a precision that would have impressed a soldier. A toothbrush in a travel-sized tube of toothpaste replaced every month. A library copy of Invisible Man he had renewed 4 times because he kept starting it over. A photograph he no longer looked at face down at the bottom of the box of a woman and a small boy standing in front of a house that no longer existed with a sky that had been very blue. And his school notebooks, 6 of them spiral-bound, one for each subject, each page covered in his small, careful handwriting. He was 17 years old and he had a 3.8 GPA. Most mornings, Beckett was up before dawn, not because he set an alarm. His phone had died in April and he had never replaced it, but because the cold woke him. There was a particular hour somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning when the temperature dropped its last few degrees and the chill moved from uncomfortable to something with intent, something that wanted in. He had learned to wake at that hour, pull the wool blanket tighter, breathe slow and deliberate until the shaking stopped and his body generated enough heat to push the cold back. Then he would lie still and think about the day ahead. The thinking was important. He had learned this from a man named Harold, who had lived under this same bridge for 2 years before the city finally got him into transitional housing. Harold was 64 years old, a Korean War veteran's son who had fallen through every crack the system had to offer. But Harold had taught Beckett one thing before he left structure was survival. Not a shelter roof over your head, not a full stomach, structure, a reason to get up, a place to be, something to do next. Every morning Beckett thought through his day in sequence. Walk to school, wash up in the gym bathroom. First period chemistry, second period English, third period calculus. Lunch, eat slowly, taste it, do not wolf it down like it might disappear. Afternoon classes, library from 3 to 5 where he helped 2 freshman students, Marcus and a girl named Addie, with their algebra homework. Then the walk back. Stop at the food pantry on Wednesdays. Check on the tarp. Read until the light was gone. He varied nothing. Variation was a luxury. The walk to Ridgefield High was 3 miles. He had worn his sneakers through to the point where he could feel the grain of the pavement through the right sole, and the left shoe had developed a flap at the toe that slapped the ground when he walked if he did not plant his foot at a precise angle. He had fixed it twice with duct tape from the hardware store, and twice the tape had given way. The third time he decided not to fix it and instead learned the angle. Ridgefield High was a big school, 1,200 students, spread across 4 floors of a brick building that had been added onto so many times over the decades that it looked like an architectural argument with itself. The gym was in the oldest part, a 1960s addition with green tile floors and lockers that shrieked when you opened them. Beckett arrived every morning 15 minutes before the first bell, slipping through the side entrance near the parking lot, while the lot was still mostly empty. He knew which teachers arrived early and which arrived late. He knew which janitors cleaned, which hallways, and what time they finished. He knew the exact schedule of morning activity in the gym building, and he had arranged his routine around it with the precision of someone who understood that invisibility was a skill requiring constant maintenance. In the gym bathroom, he kept a small Ziploc bag tucked behind the radiator pipe in the second stall. Inside, a stick of deodorant, a small bottle of unscented lotion for the dry skin on his hands, a comb, and a bar of soap. Every morning, he washed his face and neck, combed his hair, applied the deodorant, and changed from his sleeping clothes a second pair of sweatpants and an old thermal shirt he used only at night into his school clothes. His school clothes were clean. He washed them every Sunday at the laundromat on Cedar Street, where the attendant, a heavy-set woman named Donna, had once caught him counting quarters short and simply waved him through without a word. He had never forgotten that. By the time first period started, Beckett Calloway looked like any other junior at Ridgefield High. A little thin, maybe. The circles under his eyes were dark enough that a perceptive person might notice them. But his clothes were clean and his hair was combed, and when teachers called on him, he answered with a clarity and precision that made most of them assume he came from a stable home with bookshelves and a mother who asked about his homework. He had learned to wear that assumption like a second skin. The teachers who suspected something, and there were 2, maybe 3, who seemed to notice more than the others, had the decency not to ask directly. His chemistry teacher, Mr. Aldridge, had once left a brown bag lunch on Beckett's desk without comment and never mentioned it again. His English teacher, Ms. Hartwell, had a quiet way of pairing Beckett with the kids who needed tutoring, framing it as a favor she was asking of him, never as charity. He appreciated that. He appreciated it more than he would ever be able to say. What he could not appreciate, could not make peace with, no matter how carefully he managed his thinking, was the cold. The cold was different from hunger. Hunger was a manageable presence. You could distract yourself from hunger, negotiate with it, redirect your mind somewhere else. The cold would not be redirected. It occupied every square inch of your attention. It was the most honest thing in his life. It never pretended to be anything other than what it was, never offered comfort or qualification. When the temperature dropped below 30, his hands stopped working properly before he even reached the river. He had started wearing his spare pair of socks on his hands at night. October was the tipping point. October was when the current situation began to require a different kind of planning. He had spent the last 2 weeks thinking carefully about winter, about what was possible and what was not. The sleeping bag, even with the wool blanket layered over it, had limits. He knew those limits. He had found them last January before he had acquired the blanket, when he woke up one night to find he could not feel his feet and spent an hour by the river thinking about whether his feet were going to be all right before feelings started to come back. He had solutions. He was always working towards solutions. The First Methodist Food Pantry ran a coat drive every November and handed out sleeping bags to people on the street. There was a drop-in center on Archer Street that allowed overnight stays when the temperature dropped below 20 degrees. He had a plan. What he did not have was the ability to entirely silence the part of himself that was 17 years old and exhausted and cold and wanted more than anything, something as simple and unattainable as warmth. He kept that part very quiet. On the third Saturday in October, Beckett sat on the riverbank a quarter-mile downstream from the Route 9 bridge, his back against a fallen oak, his chemistry textbook open in his lap. The afternoon sun was making a weak effort through a gap in the clouds, and the light it cast was thin and golden and did almost nothing against the bite in the air. He had his flannel shirt buttoned to the top and his hands tucked into his sleeves between notes. The Coldwater River ran fast here, the current pushing hard against a curve in the bank that created a deep pool before the water straightened out again toward the old mill. The banks were steep, the soil undercut by years of high water, the tree roots exposed in tangled fingers above the waterline. Upstream, the old Hargrove Mill Bridge arched across the river, a 19th century stone structure, narrow and low with a rusted iron railing that the county had been threatening to replace for years. It was a beautiful spot in the way that places get beautiful when you have spent enough time in them to know all their moods. Beckett was working through a problem set on equilibrium constants when he heard the laughter. High and careless the way laughter sounds when it belongs to people who have never needed to be quiet. He looked upstream. Three girls stood on the Hargrove Mill Bridge maybe 50 yards away, leaning over the railing with their phones out. They were taking photos of the river, turning to take photos of each other, utterly absorbed in the performance of the afternoon. Beckett watched them for a moment. He was not unfamiliar with that kind of afternoon, the kind where you had nowhere particular to be, and the light was doing something interesting, and the world felt temporarily generous. He had not had an afternoon like that in some time. He did not begrudge them theirs. He turned back to his textbook. The scream reached him before he looked up. Not a startled sound, not the shriek of girls performing alarm for each other. A real scream, the kind that comes from the body before the mind has time to shape it, the kind that cuts through ambient noise and does something biological to the person who hears it. Beckett was on his feet before he had consciously decided to stand. He looked upstream. One of the girls was gone from the bridge. For one fractured second, he saw only two figures at the railing, their hands pressed over their mouths, their bodies rigid. Then he saw the water, a flash of color, a yellow jacket there and then under. The river at the mill bridge was deep and fast. The recent rain had pushed it to the top of its banks. The current here did not forgive inattention. Beckett was already running. He dropped the textbook on the bank without thinking. He pulled off his sneakers, both of them, not just one, because he understood even in that fractured state of moving before thinking that he needed his feet to work, and he went into the river. The cold hit him with the force of a physical blow. Not cold the way October air is cold, or cold the way a concrete floor is cold at 4 in the morning. A total encompassing cold that drove the air from his lungs and compressed his chest like a fist closing. The current took him immediately, spinning him sideways before he could establish any purchase with his feet, and for 3 full seconds he was simply in the water, and the water had him. Then instinct reasserted. He had been on swim team at Millbrook Middle School briefly before everything fell apart. He remembered the mechanics, if not the confidence arms, pulling head up, breathe on the pull kick from the hip. He got his body oriented against the current and started swimming upstream hard toward where he had seen the girl go under. His clothes were already saturated and pulling down with a weight that surprised him. Jeans, especially denim, fills with water and becomes something close to concrete. He had not thought to take them off, and there was no time now. He kicked harder and pulled harder, and the cold moved from shock into something almost meditative. A total clarity. Every non-essential thought stripped away, nothing left but the task directly in front of him. He scanned the water. The current had moved her from where she had gone under. He looked downstream, looked for anything, color, movement, disturbance in the surface. There, 10 yards ahead and slightly to his right, a hand breaking the surface. Not waving, just rising involuntary, the body doing what the body does. Beckett changed direction and swam. He reached her as she was going under again. He got his hand into her jacket, a yellow quilted jacket, expensive, soaked through and heavy, and hauled upward. She came up fighting. He had expected that. Drowning people always fight because the body does not understand that the person trying to hold them is trying to help. She clawed at his arm, and her elbow connected with his ribs hard enough to drive the breath out of him, and water got into his mouth, and he swallowed some before he could stop it. He held on. He wrapped his arm across her chest from behind, pinning her arms the way he vaguely remembered from some safety card in some waiting room somewhere. She struggled for another few seconds, desperate, terrified, her body operating on pure animal panic, and then something shifted and she went still. Not unconscious, just still. Like she had decided, some part of her had decided to trust the arm across her chest. He kicked for the bank. The current was against him. He had misjudged how far upstream he had gotten in his approach, and now the river was trying to push them both further downstream, away from the shallower water near the mill bridge. His legs were beginning to lose their precision, the cold working into the muscles, making them slow and imprecise. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel around the patch of mud and grass he was kicking toward. He did not think about anything except the bank. The girl in his arms said something he could not hear over the water. He kept kicking. His foot scraped bottom there, 6 inches of rocky riverbed, then gravel, then mud. He found his footing and stood both of them and hauled them the last 10 feet through water that went from waist deep to knee deep to ankle deep. And then they were on the bank and he was on his knees in the mud. And the girl was coughing beside him, her whole body shaking with it, coughing up river water in long convulsive heaves. Beckett knelt in the mud and breathed. His hands were shaking. The cold had gotten deep into his chest and his teeth were knocking against each other with a sound he could feel more than hear. But the girl was coughing. Coughing meant breathing. Coughing him meant alive. And the shaking in his hands gradually resolved into something that was not quite steady, but was no longer completely uncontrolled. He looked at her. She was maybe 14, maybe 15. Blonde hair plastered across her face, mascara running in dark tracks down her cheeks. She was wearing the yellow quilted jacket and dark jeans and boots that had probably cost more than everything in Beckett's cardboard box combined. She looked like someone who came from a particular kind of life, not flashy exactly, but solid. The kind of solid that does not announce itself because it does not need to. She was also looking at him between the coughs with an expression he recognized. The expression of someone who has just been very close to something enormous and final and does not yet have the language for what that means. "Are you hurt?" he managed. His voice came out rougher than he intended, his throat raw from the water. She shook her head, kept shaking. He was not sure if she was answering him or just shaking. "I can't swim," she said. The words came out between coughs. I told them I can't swim." Her friends arrived at a run from the bridge path, their faces gone the color of old paper. One of them was already on the phone, her voice high and frightened as she gave an address to someone Beckett hoped was a dispatcher. The other simply stood at the edge of the bank and stared at the girl on the ground with an expression that was either shock or the beginning of understanding what almost happened. Beckett stood up. He was soaked through and shaking with a cold that went beyond temperature into something structural, something that had gotten into the joints of him. He looked at the girl on the bank. She was sitting up now, more color coming back into her face, her friends crouching around her, and he calculated the time until the ambulance arrived and the questions that would follow and the trajectory of those questions. He had learned to think about trajectories. An ambulance meant paramedics meant questions. "Where are your parents? Can we call someone? Do you have ID?" He had answers to all of those questions, but the answers led to further questions, and the further questions led to conversations he was not prepared to have on a Saturday afternoon on a muddy riverbank while he was soaking wet and shaking. He had school on Monday. He had a test on Tuesday. He had things to do. He was looking around for his sneakers when he heard the car. A black SUV moving fast on the service road above the bank, stopping hard in the gravel. The door opened before the engine was fully off. A woman came down the bank path at something close to a run, not quite running, but moving with the compressed urgency of someone who is running on the inside. She was in her mid-40s. Blonde hair pulled back, same shade as the girl's, a few strands coming loose. She was wearing faded jeans and a leather vest over a plain gray t-shirt, and there was something in the way she moved, the economy of it, the precision that made Beckett think of people who had trained themselves not to waste motion. Not an athlete's movement, something harder earned than that. She reached her daughter and dropped to her knees in the mud without any apparent concern for her jeans. She held the girl with both arms and did not say anything for a long moment, just held her. The girl, her daughter, pressed her face into the woman's shoulder and the shaking began to ease. Then the woman looked up. She looked directly at Beckett and took him in with an attention that did not look past him or through him, but directly at him without flinching. She was reading a situation. He could feel it, the thoroughness of it, and he knew what she was seeing. Soaked jeans, wet flannel, clinging to a frame that was too thin, no shoes, dark circles, the whole picture. He knew how to read that kind of assessment. He had been assessed like that before, usually by social workers and school counselors, and the occasional well-meaning stranger. He waited for the familiar sequence, the recognition, the concern, the carefully worded questions. "You saved my daughter." Her voice was low and even, not a question. Beckett shrugged. The shrug was habit, a deflection so ingrained it activated before thought. "Anyone would have." She shook her head, a single small motion. "But you did." She stood up from the mud in one clean movement and extended her hand. She did not seem to notice or did not care that her knees were dark with riverbank mud. "I'm Marlowe." "What's your name, Beckett?" She repeated it the way people repeat a name when they are storing it somewhere specific. Not reflexively, deliberately. Becketed. Then she looked at him again, the second look, the longer one, and something shifted behind her eyes. Not pity. He knew pity, and this was not it. Something more precise than that, something that looked almost like recognition, like she was reading a situation she had read before and had not forgotten. Where are your parents? We need to thank them. Beckett felt the familiar closing down, the practiced neutrality settling over his face like a visor. I'm on my own. She held his gaze for 3 full seconds. He did not look away. Then she opened her mouth to say something he never learned what it was going to be, because the sirens arrived and the paramedics came down the bank path with their bags and their questions, and the scene dissolved into the organized chaos of aftermath. The paramedics wrapped him in a foil blanket and asked him questions about how long he had been in the water, and whether he had swallowed any, and whether he felt dizzy. And while they were asking him questions, he was watching Marlowe stand at the edge of the scene with her arm around her daughter, talking quietly with the paramedics. And he registered the way even the paramedics angled slightly toward her, the way people do around someone whose authority is not a performance, but a fact. He had answered all the questions. He had been cleared. He was fine. He looked once more for his sneakers, found them where he had dropped them in the grass, and put them back on. His feet were numb enough that he could not feel the split sole of the left one. He picked up his chemistry textbook from the bank, the pages fanned open and damp at the edges, and he tucked it under his arm. He said to no one in particular, I'm glad she's okay. Then he turned and walked away. He made the 3 miles back to the bridge in wet clothes, the late afternoon sun doing nothing useful. By the time he reached the overpass, the cold had moved into his bones in a way that felt like it had taken up residence. He hung his clothes on the rope line between the pillars and got into the sleeping bag in his thermal layer and pulled the wool blanket over the top and lay there shaking for the better part of an hour before his body temperature climbed back to something workable. He did not think about the woman named Marlowe or what she had seen when she looked at him. He opened his chemistry textbook to the damp pages and picked up where he had left off. 3 weeks passed. 3 weeks of the usual architecture of his days, which he maintained with the care of someone who understood that the days themselves were the thing, not the circumstances around them, but the shape and sequence of each hour. School, library, food pantry on Wednesdays. Work on Saturday at the Sunoco station, where the owner, a taciturn man named Gary, who had never asked a single personal question in the 6 months Beckett had been washing his windows, paid him $40 cash, and sometimes left a gas station sandwich on the counter near the register without comment. He avoided the Coldwater River, not deliberately, not with any formal intention. But when his roads took him near it, he found reasons to take different streets, and when the sound of it reached him from a distance, he felt something tight and cold in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. The second Saturday in November was gray from the start, low clouds sitting on the hills west of Ridgefield, like they had decided to stay a while. Beckett woke at the usual hour and lay in the dark thinking through his day, and noticed that the thinking felt harder than usual. The cold was deeper than it had been. The forecast he checked forecasts at the library had said low 30s overnight, and he believed it. He was going to need to rethink the winter plan. The sleeping bag was at the edge of its effective range. He needed either a better bag or a supplemental heat source, or to stop being someone who slept outside. The drop-in center on Archer Street had beds available below 20 degrees, but the Archer Street staff required ID and asked questions in a way that meant something to someone he had never been sure what, and the shelter on Broad Street had a waiting list and required a caseworker referral. He was working through this problem methodically without urgency, the way he worked through all problems when the sound reached him. He thought at first it was thunder, low and continuous coming from the east, a vibration he felt in the concrete pillar through his shoulder before he heard it distinctly. Then it resolved. Not thunder, engines. He pushed back the tarp and stood up. The access road that curved under the Route 9 bridge from the east was visible from his shelter in a straight line of about 200 yards. In the gray morning light, he could see something moving on that road. Something long and bright with chrome moving slowly, a line of headlights that seemed to have no end. Motorcycles. He counted 10 before he stopped counting. Then 20. Then he stopped trying to count at all and simply stood and watched as they came one after another, the sound building from a rumble into something that filled the underpass and resonated in his sternum. They filled the access road and then the wide concrete apron under the bridge, and then the road itself, parking in careful rows like they had done this before, like the arrangement had been considered in advance. Not 10, not 20. The number that eventually settled under that bridge was somewhere in the vicinity of 200. Beckett's back found the concrete pillar. His body made that decision before his mind was fully engaged with what he was seeing. He stood with the cold concrete against his spine and watched men and women in leather vests dismount their motorcycles with the unhurried efficiency of people who had been riding for a long time. Some of them were enormous. Some of them were not. All of them wore the same vest, black leather, with a patch on the back he could not make out at this distance. And all of them had the same quality of stillness. When they stopped moving, a stillness that did not mean inactive. There was nowhere to run, and he understood that running was not what was called for, but his body had not entirely caught up with his understanding. Then the crowd shifted. A lane opened through the middle, the rider stepping aside with a choreography that spoke of long practice. And through that lane walked a woman, Marlowe. She was wearing the same leather vest she had worn at the river, or one exactly like it. Her hair was down today, falling past her shoulders. She walked through 200 bikers with the same economy of motion he had seen on the riverbank. Nothing wasted, nothing performed. She stopped 15 feet away from him and looked at him with that particular quality of attention he had not forgotten, and he felt seen in a way that was not entirely comfortable. Behind her, a man stepped forward, 6'5" or thereabouts, with a gray beard that started at his cheekbones and reached his chest, in a presence that changed the atmospheric pressure of the space around him. He moved like someone who had learned a long time ago that his bodice said enough without his voice adding to it, and when he finally chose to speak, the voice was low and unhurried and carried across the entire concrete apron without effort. Beckett Calloway. Not a question. A statement. Like reading a name off a register. Beckett kept his back against the pillar. Yeah. The man looked at him steadily. Name's Harlan. I'm president of this chapter. He let the words land and settle. This is my family. Behind him, 200 people stood without moving in the gray November morning. Marlowe took one step forward. Her voice was quieter than Harlan's, but somehow no less present. You saved my daughter. She did not look away from his face. 3 weeks ago, you went into that river without thinking twice. Beckett said nothing. She reached into her vest and removed a folded piece of paper. She did not open it yet. Before I show you this, I want to tell you something. She paused. I have spent 3 weeks asking questions about you. I want you to know that. I want you to know that I know who you are. He felt something move through his chest, not fear exactly. Something closer to the feeling of being picked up and turned over in someone's hands. You are 17 years old, she said. You have been sleeping under this bridge since February. You have a 3.8 GPA. You help other students with their work in the library. You have been to 4 foster families, and the last one left you here and moved to Ohio without telling anyone. Beckett's jaw was tight. He said nothing. Marlowe's voice remained even. You have not once asked for help. Not from your school, not from the city, not from anyone. She looked at him for a moment. That is either the most impressive thing I have ever heard or the saddest, and I think it might be both. Harlan stepped forward then, and the paper in Marlowe's hand turned out to be a document Harlan was now holding unfolded, reading from, in a voice that carried the same flat authority as everything else about him. 2 weeks ago, I called in every favor I had in this county and a few I had in the next one. He read, found you a studio apartment on the 3rd floor of a building on Fairlane Street, owned by a member of this club. The owner has agreed to waive rent until you turn 18 and can sign your own lease. After that, you pay what you can while you are in school. He looked up. That is not charity. That is a fair deal between people who respect each other. Beckett could not speak. Something had happened to his throat. Marlowe was watching him carefully. I also spoke with Vera Dunn. She gestured to a woman at the edge of the lane, silver-haired, solid, with the particular calm of someone who had seen a great deal and remained standing afterward. Vera spent 20 years as a child welfare caseworker. She has been retired for 3 years. She has agreed to help us navigate the paperwork. Your situation has some legal complications that need addressing, and Vera knows how to address them. From somewhere in the crowd, a man stepped forward, late 50s, reading glasses pushed up on his head. I'm Warren Fisk. I'm an attorney. There are some things in your history that require legal attention. We will talk about that later when you are ready. Another man, younger, mid-20s, broad shoulders, easy grin that seems somehow genuine given the circumstances. Colt Raleigh, construction crew. I can use a weekend worker if you want the work. 15 an hour schedule works around school. He shrugged. Offer stands. Beckett looked from face to face. He counted them. He could not stop himself. It was the kind of thing his mind did, counting and cataloging when the world exceeded his ability to process it whole. Marlowe, Harlan, Vera, Warren, Colt, and behind them 200 people standing quietly in the gray morning light, their breath visible in small clouds, watching him with expressions that ranged from solemn to something that looked like it might be hope. He thought about the boy who had learned to be invisible, the boy who had learned that needs were vulnerabilities and vulnerabilities were liabilities, and that the only safe position was to want nothing that anyone could take away. He had spent 8 months perfecting that position, 8 months of structure and invisibility, and the constant, careful maintenance of a life held together with duct tape and precision. He looked at Marlowe. She was not offering him pity. He was certain of that now, as certain as he was of anything. She was offering him something that had been evaluated and decided upon by 200 people, who had dropped whatever they were doing on a Saturday morning to drive to a highway overpass and stand in the cold. "What is this?" he finally said. His voice was not steady. Marlowe did not hesitate. "This is what you do when someone jumps in the water." She held his gaze. "You jump in after them." Behind her, Harlan made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but was something adjacent to warmth. 200 people breathed out into the November air. Beckett Calloway stood with his back against a concrete pillar under Route 9 bridge with everything he owned in a cardboard box 6 feet away, and felt for the first time in 8 months the particular and unmistakable sensation of something giving way. Not collapsing, giving way, the way a door gives way when someone finally opens it from the other side. They moved him that same afternoon. Beckett had expected the process to take days, the paperwork, the arrangements, the careful bureaucratic architecture of transferring a person from one situation to another. He had experience with that architecture. He knew its hallways and its waiting rooms and its particular brand of fluorescent lit uncertainty. He had spent the better part of his life inside it. What happened instead was that Colt Raleigh handed him a set of keys and said simply, "Third floor, number 304. The elevator works on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Use the stairs the rest of the time." Then Vera Dunn produced a folder of paperwork 3 inches thick and said she would need 2 hours of his time on Monday to begin working through it. And Warren Fisk gave him a business card and said, "Call when you are ready. No rush, but do not wait too long." And then, with a choreography as organized as their arrival, 200 motorcycles departed from beneath the Route 9 bridge, leaving behind a silence that felt enormous. Marlowe was the last to leave. She stood at the edge of the concrete apron while the final bikes moved out to the access road, and she looked at Beckett with that same quality of assessment he had first noticed on the riverbank. Then she said, "My daughter wants to come by tomorrow. I told her to give you a day." Beckett said, "She does not have to." Marlowe said, "She knows that. That is why she wants to." Then she put on her helmet, swung onto her motorcycle, a dark red Harley Softail that looked like it had been maintained with professional devotion, and rode out of the underpass without looking back. Beckett stood alone for a moment in the place where he had spent 8 months and looked at what remained in the blue tarp, the rope line, the sleeping bag and blanket, the cardboard box, the accumulated material of a life held very carefully together. He folded everything with the same precision he had always used. The clothes, the blanket, the photograph face down tucked between 2 folded shirts. He loaded it all into a single duffel bag that Colt had left behind without comment, a large canvas bag with reinforced handles, the kind built for actual weight, and picked it up and walked out of the underpass without looking back. The apartment at 304 Fairlane Street was on the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse building 4 blocks from the center of Ridgefield. The building had been brick since 1887, and someone had spent considerable money and care on the conversion-exposed beams, original windows with their wavy glass, still intact hardwood floors that creaked in specific places. The studio was small, 1 main room, a kitchen alcove, a bathroom with a clawfoot tub that had been retrofitted with a shower. But it was warm. That was the thing that undid him briefly privately in the first minutes alone in that apartment. The radiator against the east wall was putting out steady heat, and when Beckett stood in the middle of the room and let that heat reach him, something happened in his chest that he was not prepared for. Not relief exactly, something older than relief, something the body remembers before the mind does. He stood there for perhaps 2 minutes. Then he unpacked his bag, arranged his clothes in the small closet, placed his notebooks on the table near the window, and put the photograph still face down in the drawer of the bedside table. He did not look at it. He sat on the edge of the bed, a real mattress, a bed frame, 2 pillows, and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Outside, the gray November afternoon was darkening toward evening. The sounds of the street came up through the old windows, a car, voices a dog somewhere. The ordinary, unremarkable sound of a city living at Saturday. He tried to feel something clean and simple about what had happened. Gratitude, maybe the pure, uncomplicated kind. But it kept arriving mixed with other things, a wariness he could not entirely suppress, the trained skepticism of someone who had learned that generosity sometimes came with architecture of its own obligations and expectations built into the foundation that only became visible later. He had not asked for this. He had not known to want it. He was not sure yet how to hold it. Sunday arrived with pale winter light and the smell of coffee from the apartment below. Sadie Voss knocked on his door at 10:30. She was wearing a green jacket today, not yellow, and her hair was in a braid that had come partially loose. She looked different than she had on the riverbank. The shock was gone.